Welcome, one and all, sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers, to another one of my special wizard tales.
Thumbelina. Poor widow Hobbs was sad. It was her birthday, and she had no one to share her birthday cake with. No one except Percival the pig.
Would you like a piece of birthday cake, Percival?
She asked the happy pig. When the widow took the cake outside, she was surprised to see a raggedly dressed old man with a long white beard. The old man was hungry, so the kindly widow gave him a piece of her birthday cake. After he'd gobbled down the cake, the old man asked the widow if there was any way he could reward her for her good turn. Widow Hobbs sighed and said that the only thing she ever wanted was to have a child. But alas, it was too late for that to happen. Suddenly, the old man waved his arm, and with a swirl of fairy dust, he turned into a magician. Widow Hobbs and Percival the pig were amazed at the figure that now stood before them.
May I present myself, madam? I am the marvelous magician,
he stated. The magician then presented the widow with a single barley seed as a reward for her. The widow was confused. A barley seed didn't seem like much of a reward. But the magician laughed. This was no ordinary barley seed. It was a magic seed. He carefully instructed the widow that she was to plant the seed in a pot of her best soil and make a wish on the night of each new moon. If the widow had faith, her wish would be granted. With that, the magician disappeared in a sparkling cloud. And so the widow Hobbs carefully followed her instructions. She planted the seed and put it on the windowsill, and on the night of the new moon, she made a wish.
My dream is for a child. Oh, wishing star, even if it were only a little child, I would be so happy.
She wished. The next morning, the widow was delighted to see her barley seed had sprouted into a flower bud. Over the next few days, the flower bud grew and grew, and it began to make strange noises. The puzzled widow looked closer and saw that the flower had opened. And what's more, there was something inside. A beautiful tiny baby girl. When the widow picked the tiny baby up in the palm of her hand, she saw that it was no bigger than her thumb. And this gave her an idea.
Yes, Thumbelina. I shall call you Thumbelina,
she decided. The widow then found an old blue glove she hadn't used for many years. She snipped off the thumb, and with some clever sewing, she made Thumbelina a lovely little dress. The tiny girl was thrilled.
Oh, thank you, Mother. It's beautiful. I do love you so much,
said excited Thumbelina. Thumbelina and the widow Hobbs had a wonderful time together. They laughed and played. Thumbelina danced with the widow's hand, and they even made cookies together. At the end of every day, Widow Hobbs would read Thumbelina bedtime stories about handsome princes and beautiful children. Life was happy, except for Percival the pig. You see, before Thumbelina came along, Percival was the widow's only friend, and now the pig was feeling jealous. He grumbled. Percival's opportunity came on the night of the next new moon. The widow had put Thumbelina's tiny crib on the windowsill so the little girl could look at the beautiful stars. The widow blew out the candle and went to bed.
Good night, Mother.
said the sleepy girl. Jealous Percival the pig showed tiny sleeping Thumbelina to a nasty toad.
What a stroke of luck! My son would love to meet her.
Croaked the toad as he picked up Thumbelina's tiny crib. Carrying the sleeping Thumbelina, the toad hopped off to his home far away in a slimy swamp. Next morning when she woke up, Thumbelina was shocked to find herself sitting on a lily pad in the middle of the swamp. She called out for her mother, but the widow was far away and couldn't hear Thumbelina's tiny voice. The nasty toad introduced Thumbelina to his son, Toby. Toby thought it would be better if he married a toad, but his father insisted that Thumbelina was the bride for him. So Toby reluctantly agreed, and the wedding was set for that very afternoon. Poor Thumbelina. A kindly fish had been listening to the toad and felt sorry for little Thumbelina. He grabbed onto the lily pad and towed Thumbelina away from the swamp and down the river. The toad gave chase, but the fish was too fast, and Thumbelina escaped. The river carried Thumbelina far away. She floated through a forest full of strange-looking trees, and then she started drifting faster and faster towards a waterfall. Cried the tiny girl. But just as she was about to be swept away, a friendly dragonfly plucked Thumbelina from her lily pad and set her down right on the back of a caterpillar. After a brief ride on poor, confused Mr. Caterpillar, Thumbelina sat down by the river and thought of her mother. Just then, Thumbelina's mother, Widow Hobbs, discovered that her tiny daughter was missing.
Thumbelina! Thumbelina! Please! Where are you?
She cried. Of course, Percival the pig knew what had happened to Thumbelina, but he wasn't telling anyone. Meanwhile, Thumbelina began to look around at what was going on by the riverbank. She couldn't believe her eyes. Behind the leaves, tiny Thumbelina saw all sorts of insects, and they were all the same size as her. The insects were busy preparing for an end-of-season ball to mark the coming of autumn. As the autumn leaves began to drift down in the wind, Thumbelina realized something quite startling. She was cold. So she tried to think what she could use to make something warm to wear. Mistress Spider, who was weaving her web nearby, suggested that Thumbelina should make a warm winter's cape using feathers. And with that, Mistress Spider scooped up Thumbelina and set her down in an old bird's nest. There were plenty of spare feathers lying about, and Mistress Spider helped Thumbelina fashion a beautiful cape.
Oh, it's lovely and so warm. Thank you so very much, Mistress Spider,
said grateful Thumbelina. As night fell, Mistress Spider tucked Thumbelina up in the old bird's nest. It was a cold night, but a beautiful one, and snuggled up under a leaf, Thumbelina looked up at the stars and watched the pretty fireflies. By morning, the wind was blowing quite hard, and the air was full of autumn leaves. All of a sudden, a gust of wind plucked up Thumbelina's leaf. The only problem was, the wind plucked up Thumbelina as well. Clutching her leaf, Thumbelina tumbled through the air.
Ah! Whoa! Oh, Mistress Spider, help me!
But Mistress Spider didn't hear, and Thumbelina was blown far away from the woodlands. She swirled and twirled with the autumn leaves, hanging on with all her might. The wind dropped, and Thumbelina and her leaf drifted down into some long grass. The poor little girl was lost and frightened. She missed her mother and started to cry. Suddenly, a friendly voice squeaked out,
Cheer up! It can't be that bad.
It was Miss Mouse, and she happily invited Thumbelina into her nest, where there was a lovely fire and some delicious barley soup. As they drank their soup, Miss Mouse, who liked to be called Mousie, chatted with Thumbelina and listened to her amazing adventures. Suddenly, the ground began to shake, and poor Thumbelina thought she was about to start another adventure. But it wasn't an earthquake. It was Mousie's friend, silly Mr. Mole, who had burrowed up through the floor. Thumbelina had never met a mole before, and she was surprised to discover that he was very shy. Mousie explained that moles were the shyest creatures in the world.
That's why we stay underground. Who'd want to see us?
Added Mr. Mole. But Thumbelina liked Mr. Mole and wanted to be his friend. Happy to have a new friend, Mr. Mole showed Thumbelina a beautiful doll's top hat that had fallen into his hole. They all laughed when he tried it on, and Mr. Mole invited Thumbelina over to his house. So Mr. Mole showed Mousie and Thumbelina his house. It was a funny sort of house. Really, it was just a big hole in the ground, but Mr. Mole was very proud of it, and Thumbelina said it looked lovely. When they got back to her house, Mousie started to yawn and told Thumbelina it was time for hibernation. But Thumbelina was confused.
Hibernation? What's that?
She asked. Mousie started to explain that hibernation was the time when creatures like her fell asleep for the entire winter. But before Mousie finished her explanation, she fell asleep. On into the winter, Mousie slept in hibernation, while Thumbelina waited by the fireside, warming her toes. Poor Thumbelina was lonely sitting there in silence. Most of all, the little girl missed her mother.
I wonder if she's missing me.
She thought to herself. Poor Widow Hobbs was missing her Thumbelina. She thought about the tiny girl every day. Now that it was winter, the widow had brought Percival in from the cold barn. The pig was warming himself in front of the fire when the widow began to sob about the missing Thumbelina. Knowing he was to blame, Percival the pig felt very guilty, and he began to sob too. Thumbelina looked out the window of Mousie's house and was amazed to see millions of tiny white specks falling from the sky.
Oh my! How beautiful!
She exclaimed. The little girl woke up Mousie so that she could witness this amazing sight. But Mousie laughed when she saw what Thumbelina was so excited about, for it was just snowflakes. When Mousie heard that Thumbelina had never seen snow before, she decided to wake up Mr. Mole. Together, they would take Thumbelina outside to play in the snow. Outside in the crisp white snow, Mr. Mole and Mousie tried to show Thumbelina what fun she could have sliding down a snow-covered hill. But try as she might, Thumbelina just couldn't slide on the snow. Mousie realized what was the problem.
No fur! That's what... Thumbelina has no fur to slide on.
She stated. So the animals came up with a very clever plan. Thumbelina and Mousie slid down the hill while sitting on top of Mr. Mole. They slid down very fast, and it was great fun, until they crashed into a frozen lake and spun around and around in circles. Mr. Mole and Mousie went headfirst into the snow. Thumbelina thought this was very funny. She laughed and laughed, but her two friends were not amused.
Thumbelina, that's very thoughtless of you,
said cranky Mousie. Thumbelina hadn't meant to hurt her friend's feelings, and she apologized at once. But it was too late. Mousie and Mr. Mole stomped off, leaving Thumbelina all alone on the frozen lake. Sad Thumbelina didn't know what to do. But before she could do anything, the tiny girl heard a sad cry.
Oh, I say! Help! Help!
It was a swallow. The poor bird had become trapped in the snow and needed Thumbelina's help to get out. Of course, Thumbelina did help, and the swallow was most grateful. He explained to her that birds didn't hibernate like Mousie and Mr. Mole. Instead, birds migrated. So the swallow thanked Thumbelina for helping him and flew off to join his bird friends as they flew home after the winter. Poor Thumbelina was alone again. Suddenly, a fierce spring storm broke. Thumbelina was frightened by the crashing thunder and flashing lightning. Lost, alone, and far from home, poor soaking wet Thumbelina began to cry.
I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go home. Home to my mother.
She sobbed. And so, sad Thumbelina fell asleep. But when she woke, everything had changed. Spring had arrived, and all the fields were covered in beautiful flowers. But what really cheered her up was the fact that somebody was calling her name. It was her friend, the swallow.
Oh, Swallow, I'm so very glad to see you.
Exclaimed Thumbelina. Swallow told Thumbelina that he'd been worrying about her being so far from her home. So he had left his bird friends and flown back to see her. Swallow then promised to fly Thumbelina all the way back to where she had started her adventure. Of course, Thumbelina was thrilled. The swallow crouched down low so that Thumbelina could clamber up onto his back.
Hold on now. I don't want to drop you.
Warned Swallow, and Thumbelina did hold on with all her might. Up into the sky they soared, high above the fields and trees. As she looked down, Thumbelina began to recognize things. Down there was Mr. Mole's house and Mousie's house too. And over there was the hill they'd had such fun sliding down when it was snowing. Thumbelina could even see the glen where she sat on Mr. Caterpillar and met Mistress Spider. With the tiny girl sitting on his back, the swallow soared through the clear blue sky. Suddenly, Thumbelina squealed with delight. There below her were the woods and the river she had floated down when she escaped from the nasty toad.
Oh, Swallow, here. Please, can we go down here? I see someone I know.
Cried the excited Thumbelina. Swallow glided down and gently landed right next to Thumbelina's friend, Mr. Caterpillar. As she said hello to Mr. Caterpillar, the most amazing thing happened. He turned into a beautiful butterfly right before her eyes. While Thumbelina and Swallow watched, the butterfly fluttered from flower to flower, and as he touched each one, they sprang open to reveal tiny little children, just like Thumbelina.
Flower children? Oh, how wonderful!
Said the delighted little girl. And more surprises soon followed. The tiny, handsome Prince of Flowers introduced himself to Thumbelina and welcomed her to the Garden of Flowers. The little children were making quite a lot of noise, and Percival the pig came over to investigate. He was delighted to see Thumbelina and ran back to the cottage to fetch the widow Hobbs. The widow followed Percival back into the garden and was amazed to find Thumbelina and her little friends.
Oh, my Thumbelina! You've come back to me!
Exclaimed the widow as happy Thumbelina climbed onto her hand. Thumbelina looked around and was delighted to see all her friends had arrived. Mistress Spider, Mr. Caterpillar, who was really a butterfly, Mr. Mole, and dear Mousie. Widow Hobbs was happy too. She understood now why the magician had given her the gift of Thumbelina. He wanted the lonely widow to know she had lots of wonderful friends. And they were right there, in her own garden.
thus another fine wizard tale concludes. Sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers, join me again soon for another classic tale. Won't you?